Good afternoon and good evening to those who are joining us from outside the United States. My name is Marjorie Chorlins. I'm the Executive Vice President for Europe at the U.S. Chamber, and I'm also the Executive Director for the InSTEP series. Welcome to the fifth InSTEP session of 2022. In our last InSTEP program, we explored the economic ramifications of today's turbulent international landscape and the impacts of rising inflation, supply chain snarls, shutdowns in China, wide-ranging sanctions imposed on Russia, and so on. This turmoil takes place against the broader background of demographic change, technological change, climate change, and more. When we think about the tectonic changes underway around the world, young people are often on the front lines. Today, there are 2.4 billion young people ages 10 to 29 living in the world, the largest youth population in history. Put another way, over half the world's population is under 30. What do we know about these emerging generations? They're globally and digitally connected. They grew up with the United States involved in multiple overseas conflicts. Relative to older generations, younger Americans are less supportive of the use of military force abroad, but are equally or more supportive of international trade, cooperation, and diplomacy. Unlike the great power competition that defined the threat landscape for older generations, millennials and Gen Zers face a range of new threats, including disinformation, disruptive technologies, threats to democratic institutions, and of course, climate change. We need to better understand their perspectives since they provide a mirror on our future. It's not just the business community that recognizes this, of course. Last month, USAID released an updated youth and development policy that gives younger people greater agency in designing development programs and policies. Nato has a Young Leaders Advisory Board, as studies show younger generations expressing less understanding of the value of that signature alliance. The World Economic Forum actively engages young leaders in their forum initiatives. Of course, with millennials predicted to make up 75% of the US workforce by 2025, elder statesmen will not just be seeking their foreign policy views in separate youth-focused formats, but increasingly working alongside them in government and international institution leadership roles. I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation and the chance to introduce you to three dynamic young women who make me optimistic about what the future may hold. Let me start with brief introductions. I'll start with Olivia Seltzer, founder and sole author of the Cramm, a daily newsletter which reaches over 2.5 million Gen Z readers in 113 countries. She's also the author of Cramm This Book. Olivia launched the Cramm in February 2017 and has since been featured on NPR, The Today Show, and in The Economist, Forbes, and elsewhere. She'll be a first-year student at Harvard University in the fall. We're also fortunate to be joined by Alexandria Maloney, who is Senior Membership Manager at the Truman National Security Project. Prior to joining Truman, Alexandria served as an International Affairs officer at the Department of Defense, where she focused on foreign partner engagements primarily in the Middle East. A core theme in Alexandria's work has been her commitment to build the pipeline for the next generation of underrepresented international affairs professionals. She currently serves as president of Black Professionals in International Affairs and is the founding co-chair of Foreign Policy for America's Diversity in National Security Working Group. Finally, we're pleased to be joined by Sarah Heck, who is head of entrepreneurship for Stripe and a board member of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Sarah was previously director for global engagement on the National Security Council, where she led entrepreneurship policy, youth demographics, and private sector engagement. She also held several positions at the Department of State, including roles focused on public diplomacy, countering violent extremism, and entrepreneurship. Earlier in her career, Sarah also did international government affairs work for Chevron and worked with Fortune 500 companies at Kissinger-McClarty. Before we dive into the questions, I'd like to ask each of you about some of your formative experiences. Olivia, I'm going to start with you. We're going to hear from you momentarily about the Cramm and some of your motivations for creating it. But I want to start with your inspirations. I understand that your great-grandfather was a refugee from the former Soviet Union who settled in Mexico City, and that your grandfather was an immigrant who came to the United States from Mexico. Do you think your family story prompted you to take a wider view of the world than you might otherwise have?
Yeah, I definitely think it did, because the same issues that they were facing and that they were having to work to combat and work to survive through are the same issues that people are having to do the same thing with now. So my great grandparents, they were Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union. They were forced to flee the pogroms. Only 3 countries were willing to take them in. That's a very similar situation to what many refugees are facing today. They eventually settled in Mexico City. My grandfather ended up illegally immigrating to the United States. He was fortunate enough to gain citizenship, but he also went through that experience of being an undocumented immigrant, which is one that's so common today and so relevant to the news, and also to the community I grew up in. There were so many kids I went to school with who were the children of undocumented immigrants. So it definitely I think made it so I didn't have a choice of whether or not to be engaged in the world and to be engaged in these issues, because I had such a direct connection through my family and also through the people I was around.
Fantastic. Thanks, Olivia. Alexandria, we see plenty of American students spend their junior year of university abroad, but you chose to do your undergraduate degree in Italy before embarking on postgraduate studies here in the US. How did you make that decision, and how do you think that experience played a role in your early career?
Hi, Marjorie. Thank you so much for having me today. So I would say that pursuing my full BA, Bachelor's of Art in International Affairs overseas at a private American school called John Cabot University in Italy really formed my view of the world. I was interacting and engaging with international classmates and coworkers, where I was learning so many different views that I don't know if I would have had such a vast exposure to at a university or a college where the population may be, similar to myself or those of my own culture.
Right. Very interesting and very wise, I think, to do that in Italy. Sarah, let's turn to you. You've had a longstanding commitment to youth leadership and entrepreneurship. One way you engaged in this area earlier in your career was through your work in Paraguay with Amigos de las Americas. Tell us about that experience, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, listening to all of you, I think this is certainly a generation that has had international opportunities in one way or another from a very young age, and I think we're very grateful for that. For me, I volunteered as a high school student and then was on staff with, as you mentioned, Amigos de las Americas, which is a nonprofit youth organization that takes young people from across the Western Hemisphere and allows them to do community projects, community-based initiatives in communities across Latin America. It was a truly formative experience for me, living with a host family on the border of Paraguay and Argentina, and then going on to be a supervisor with the program, and then on to be their country director as a college junior. I think both opened my eyes to what international affairs meant and shaped sort of the trajectory of my career for sure, but also gave me skills that I wouldn't have been able to gain in such a sort of at such an early age if it hadn't been for an organization that was investing in young people and investing in youth leadership from high school and college age.
Thanks very much for that. It's fascinating. I think you're absolutely right that having those experiences of interacting with people in other cultures and other countries really does fundamentally change your perspective on issues. And I hope that more people will be able to travel and generate those experiences. Olivia, let's dive into it. Tell our audience about the Cramm, why you created it, and how you've been able to grow it so significantly. What was it about the existing news coverage that you considered kind of a barrier to entry for young people to engage with and understand the news?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So, after the 2016 US presidential election, I noticed that everyone at my junior high school was talking a lot about the news and the election and its results and how it was impacting our community, but none of us were actually reading or watching the news. And I found that this was because it's primarily created by and targeted towards an older demographic, and it unfortunately wasn't connecting. And I think a big reason for that was the mediums it was trying to reach our audience through, the language that was being used. It had this assumption that we had knowledge of certain events that we maybe didn't have knowledge of because we hadn't learned about these events in school yet, or we hadn't lived through these events yet. So the combination of these things, I think, created a really big barrier of entry. Aside from the fact that, as interested as my generation was, they just felt that these news outlets just weren't for us. So it made it really difficult to dive into that space. And I saw that as a really big problem because sort of at the core of what I do with the Cramm is the concept that you can't change the world unless you know about it, which sounds very simple, but is very true. If you don't know about something going on in the world, you can't exactly do anything to try to fix it or to try to help the people being impacted. So I had always loved writing. So in February 2017, I started waking up at 5 a.m. every day to read the news, create relevant stories, and then rewrite them in a way that speaks to my generation before sending it out across multiple platforms, including email, text, and social media posts, and then heading off to junior high school. So I've been doing that over the past, I think, 5 years now. And at first, I was super, super shy and quiet, which is why it was such a great way for me to get involved in the world. I didn't have to talk to anyone. But over the following months, I sort of realized that no one was going to find out about it if I just did that. So I started going with a group of my friends to local college campuses and malls and things like that, and actually just like asking for people's email addresses and phone numbers and signing them up. And before long, we had young people doing that all over the world in their respective communities.
Wow.
And it also really grew online too, with young people saying, oh, hey, I'm reading this thing called the Cramm every day. You should read it too. We started having teachers using it in classes and assigning their students assignments based off what they had read in the Cramm. So it really took off in this sort of grassroots way, which was very exciting for me.
Fantastic. Well, apparently you got up very early because you've also written a new book called Cramm That Book. And you came up with that as a way to chronicle the history that's made the world what it is today. You talked a little bit about why you did the Cramm, but tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so over the years of writing the Cramm, I've realized that there's this sort of assumption in the news, which I talked about a bit earlier, that we all have knowledge of the major events that have happened over the past century or so. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't have that knowledge, which can make it really difficult to understand what's happening in the world today. So as a young person experiencing that every day, reading the news and having to do all this extra research, I really wanted to write a book that would solve that problem and effectively give my generation and really anyone the background to the current events shaping our world today. So that's really where Cramm This Book came from.
Gotcha. I hesitate to call it something like foreign policy for old dummies, but maybe that's what it is. Alexandra, turning to you. The business community and investors are embracing the need for more diverse and inclusive workplaces to enhance their bottom line results. We know the same need exists in government, especially when it comes to foreign policy, which is why I think we've seen the State Department name its first diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. This is an issue you've taken by the horns over the course of your career, including your leadership of Black professionals in international affairs. What needs to be done to make the foreign affairs field more welcoming to underrepresented communities? And how important is it to have a more representative talent pool to achieving better foreign policy outcomes?
Thank you, Marjorie. So this definitely starts with our values, right? So as an organization, as institutions, and as individuals. So taking a look at the culture of our organizations, are we open to leaning into understanding some hard truths sometimes about what that means about the work environment for those who are, associated with the organization, as well as the climate of the places that we're working. What actions are we taking to be more inclusive, for example? And so I think that that's definitely the starting point when asking ourselves as the leaders of organizations, current and rising, how can we be more welcoming to not only underrepresented communities, but our nation and communities as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And do you think involving more diverse voices makes for better foreign and national security policy?
Excellent question. So my answer would be yes, absolutely. Having more diverse voices does make us more robust and help to solve for more challenging questions, and more variety and diversity of knowledge and experience, as well as perspective. But I like to argue that the diverse talent pool is not always enough, right? We may have a diverse talent pool, but are there still barriers of entry for prospective candidates that organizations need to address? Or, as I mentioned earlier, are there elements of the organizational culture and structure in retaining the talent that we do have? And I think that this is very important because it comes down to, are we equipped as a nation, right, to compete internationally,
Right.
To build the best and the brightest? So organizations that I'm a part of, BBIA, Truman, Diversity and National Security Network, Foreign Policy for America, are all really committed to building and training the next and current, leaders of our national security and international affairs fields.
And are you seeing a lot of interest?
Absolutely. And what's actually what's been surprising for us is the pandemic has increased the visibility, with us having to do a lot of virtual shift, that we've been able to reach, from students up to mid-level professionals. Our reach has gone a lot farther than in what I like to call the before times. We were more in person and Washington, D.C. based.
Gotcha. Thank you. Sarah, turning to you, you have had a really interesting career focus at sort of the intersection of youth and entrepreneurship policy and national security. So I'd like to ask you a two-part question. First, can you explain the nexus between national security and entrepreneurship, and why the NSC invests in entrepreneurship policy as part of its global engagement strategy?
Sure.
And then second, if you don't mind, I'm going to put it on the
table. Sorry.
Millennials and Gen Zers have grown up with a far greater comfort with technology, and also a motivation to want to address the big problems out there. What role can you and your peers play in terms of entrepreneurial innovation to address those global challenges?
Yeah, so I think to your first question about what's the intersection between entrepreneurship and national security and foreign policy, I think that this is an area that national security professionals have watched demographic shifts, but also it's not just demographic shifts. The fact that it's not just young people, but it's civil society and it's entrepreneurs, and it's people outside of government, the people that haven't traditionally been on the other side of the diplomacy table with a little flag that represents a country, that are drastically changing the way that we all work, live, study, and interact. And so I think, part of why this has been something that has become more mainstream in national security and foreign policy is that realization that if you're not talking to or not understanding a huge swath of populations in the US and abroad that are having these impacts on society, then there's no way that you can possibly make foreign policy and national security decisions that are effective for the United States. Gotcha. I would also say that I think that there is a realization, whether it's on climate change or it's on violent extremism and terrorism, or it's on disinformation, that some of the best solutions are not going to necessarily come from the people that have been trained in foreign policy and national security. And it's really a job of a foreign policy professional to go out and find the most talented people. And so, something that I used to always say with colleagues at the State Department is that part of our job was to go out there and talent scout people that had solutions to problems. And I feel like that is even more important today. We know that there are corners of the world and corners of the internet where people are creating, building incredible things, but also creating and building destructive things. And so I think that it's incumbent upon all of us, as we think about sort of what does the future of foreign policy look like, to make sure that we're being inclusive, not only in the sense of diversity and inclusion, which is so important because it allows us to find more of those communities, but also to make sure that we're not in our little bubble of people that love to read The Economist every day, or read 14 newspapers before 9 o'clock, that we're sort of looking to different spaces to find those people and find those solutions. To your second question of sort of technology and what the role we all have to play, I think particularly, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think where you were going was sort of, Silicon Valley and policy. I often think of myself as one of the people, and there are many of us out there that have to be translators between the technology world and the policy world. The technology and policy worlds are totally interconnected these days, and oftentimes we don't speak the same language. In fact, sitting here in San Francisco today, there are many countries that have ambassadors or envoys to Silicon Valley because they have realized the power of this technology and they want to understand it. Of course, the U.S. government is increasingly doing things of that nature as well. But I really do think that going forward, we know that there are lots of opportunities with technology, but we all also understand that there are ways that technology can be used for ill means. And so, I think you're seeing a lot more focus on how to be responsible with technology. But also, I think from the government side, people saying, oh, you know what, we need to understand this more. We need to understand engineers. We need to understand how products get built. Because if there's not this mutual understanding between these two worlds, we're never going to be able to be the most effective in bringing about outcomes and solutions that are important for U.S. national security.
Do you think, just to follow up, that that millennials and Gen Zers feel like they can trust the information that they find through various social media outlets? I mean,
I feel like I'm an old millennial, so I'm not sure if I can best answer that question. Maybe Olivia's audience is she might have a better answer. I think there's a wide variety of information out there. And part of it is people that I think there are some millennials and Gen Zers that are increasingly realizing, wow, if I'm not part of the solution, then I'm just sort of a taker of a lot of problems in this world. And so I think that they are getting very engaged. On a daily basis, I deal with entrepreneurs from around the world, and when on those days, I feel the most hopeful about the direction of the world. But I think that there are a lot of, as we all know, a lot of people out there from across generations that don't necessarily have the skills to differentiate between something that's true or something that's disinformation. And I think it's also about the communities that we build. It's not just about the information that's out there. How can we insulate ourselves from some of the ill will and the disinformation that's out there? So, I wouldn't paint Gen Z or millennials with a broad brush, but I do think we need to have new ways of communicating with this generation, as you all are talking about, but also realizing that they are very thoughtful about these issues, and the global crises that we see every day are affecting this generation in a way that is much faster and much more in their face than I think perhaps other generations, and so they're engaged.
Fantastic. Olivia, I do want to come back to you now and ask you about one specific area where you engaged readers of the Cramm for their perspectives. In 2019, you delivered remarks at the Nato Engages forum to better involve youth in the Alliance's future work. In your remarks, you shared feedback from a survey you had conducted with your Cramm readership on views towards NATO. Can you tell us what were the top takeaways from that survey, and what recommendations did you make to the NATO leaders as a result?
Yeah, I think I honestly had no idea what people were going to say, so I was really intrigued to see the responses. The overwhelming response was a lot of people straight up did not know what NATO was. I'm so sorry if you hear my dog barking. She's barking at me right now. But the overwhelming responses were a lot of people did not know what NATO was, or they knew generally that it was something to do with government and policy, but they didn't know specifically what it did. And also that they had no idea that it actually had any involvement with climate change. So that was a really big thing NATO wanted me to specifically ask was, does Gen Z know that we get involved with climate change? Because that's obviously an issue that is so relevant to us. So sorry again about my talk. So a big recommendation that I gave to them was to try to find ways to engage Gen Z and to actually sort of meet us where we're at. And I think it was really interesting to sit in the audience throughout that day because I was the last speaker and to hear all these world leaders, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, speak about how they really wanted young people to get engaged. And I was sort of sitting there in the audience thinking, I feel like we are already engaged, but we really just want the older demographics to meet us where we're at and actually work together with us on the issues we care about. So that was really the main recommendation that I gave.
And has there been any follow-up with NATO as a result?
Yeah, actually, the organization that organized the NATO Engages event, they did ask me to come back to speak another couple of times and to sort of give that Gen Z perspective. I think just generally throughout working with the Cramm and meeting all these different people and connecting with people from not just my generation, I've seen that people are just really eager to hear how my generation thinks and how we see the world and just eager to connect with us.
Well, thank you for that. I have to say, I'm glad that people are learning about NATO, thanks to your work, because there is the current circumstances we're facing in this world have simply underscored, I think, the importance of the NATO alliance and the need to keep it strong. So kudos to you for finding ways to bring youth voices into the mix. Alexandria, I want to stay in the security realm and ask you a question. Now, evidence shows that more inclusive peace processes in combat zones have a better chance of success. This is an issue that you explored a few years ago in a discussion you led at the C20, the civil society engagement group to the G20. Why is it important to engage youth and other underrepresented voices in peace building and security efforts? And what, if anything, has changed since that discussion at the C20? I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I apologize. You would think 3 years after a virtual life we would, but here we
No worries.
In many of these efforts, particularly peace building and security, those who are on the ground, kind of face to face with the actual implementation of these efforts, our civil society, our everyday citizens, are not often the same individuals who are in the office who may be writing that policy. And I consider it essential. So not only to engage, but to also train and empower our youth, our underrepresented voices, and the next generation, those who will be responsible for handling these really complex challenges. So when we see, a crisis or a refugee situation in Ukraine or Afghanistan, for example, we should be teaching and sharing what were the decision points, why was this the particular response, what were the strategies, what were the best practices, what could we have done differently? Because if we don't prepare the next generation of leaders, history speaks all the time. I mean, it's very blatant to me, at least, that we will likely be, in a cycle of repeating similar situations and similar conflicts over time.
Do you see, just a follow-up question, similar efforts, this is really a question to all of you, in fact, similar efforts to those you're undertaking here to draw in younger generations into foreign and security policy? Do you see that happening in other countries around the world? Alexandria?
So at least from my experience, I have seen it. I'm also a member of a network called the European Leadership Network. They have a kind of rising leader organization, and there's a lot of work there being done to engage civil society. There's also the United Nations has a few different groups. I know Create 2030, for example, is probably one of the larger organizations that are engaging youth and underrepresented communities around the world on how to become these change agents within their own community, and how to amplify that at an international stage and the international level.
Fantastic. I think it's clear that we need to have similar voices rising all around the globe. Sarah, I want to talk to you a little bit about public diplomacy and national security. When you were at the NSC, you focused on expanding the impact of public diplomacy on national security. And you pursued similar objectives at state with your work to counter violent extremism. As you sought to better explain America to the world and to help people understand America, how did you leverage the voices and the communications tools of the younger generations?
So I think a lot of our public diplomacy work, both at the State Department and at the White House during the Obama administration, was really focused on building networks and building communities of young people and young leaders across demographics and across sectors. And I think a lot of our approach to it was, let's find great people doing great things, connect them, and then let them choose the forum, the tool, the piece of technology that's going to help them stay better connected, and we will follow their lead. So I think that is a sort of great way, as I think Olivia sort of demonstrates in her daily work, figure out what this generation or the community that you want to connect with is doing and follow their lead. I think when governments sort of put a line in the sand and say, we're only communicating with people via Twitter, or we're only communicating with them via email, or they have to come into the embassy, that's probably not going to yield the most effective results. And so I think, whether it was the Young African Leaders Initiative, YALI, which was so successful under Obama, and then the Southeast Asian version of that and the Latin American version of that, that continue to go strong today, or to the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, which was a hallmark of the Obama administration and carried on into the Trump administration. We were finding these people, connecting them, and then letting them do their thing and remaining connected with the United States. So, also, what did they need? Did they need to find, if they were entrepreneurs, investors? We can help with that. If they were young people in civil society working on an issue, did they need help with management of nonprofits? Well, we have experts that can connect them with that. And so really putting an ear to the ground, making sure that we were sort of leading from behind, letting them lead and do their thing. And also sort of making sure that we were being entrepreneurial alongside of them as we thought about our foreign policy.
Fantastic. I want to ask you, in sort of bringing these diverse voices together, when you think about the folks who are older than the millennials and Gen Z, how did they react to some of what you tried to do? I mean, did they hear the differences of message? Did they react? Were there any aha moments for folks when you were working with them?
I think on the whole, our diplomats, our civil corps, our members of the military, they see what's going on around the world. It might not be the most comfortable spot. They might be of a different generation, but they want to do the thing that's right for the United States of America. We all have the same mission when we work in the government. And so I think, it was actually sort of an invigorating way for people of even older generations that serve the U.S. government to realize that they were having an impact, sometimes perhaps more of an impact when you found a community that's doing incredible things on an issue you care about that might be more impactful than the bilateral meeting that you had 3 weeks ago around a diplomatic table. That these are people that are actually making change on the ground day to day. And so I think I don't want to be sort of ageist or think that there's sort of huge differences between generations, because I do think most people that serve the U.S. government realize what's going on. I also think, I mean, I'm not in the U.S. government anymore, but if there are ever silver linings to the pandemic, I imagine that these tools that may have been clunky or difficult for even people that are my age to use, we were all forced into doing it. And so I think, we particularly in foreign policy and national security, look at opportunities, new opportunities that maybe would not have been thought possible in the bureaucracy of 5 or 10 years ago, but are totally possible today, and allow us to reach a generation that is really making impact.
Fantastic. I want to ask you a question before we get to the round robin, and it's a question to all of you. Any of you who'd like to respond. We're talking obviously a lot about the executive branch, given we're talking about foreign policy, but we can't forget, of course, that up Pennsylvania Avenue, there is another critical branch of government, and that's the Congress. Olivia, let's start with you. I mean, have you engaged with members of Congress to sort of make your voice heard and let them understand, help them understand a little bit about what you're doing, and has that prompted any follow-on action from them?
Yeah, so a big part of what I do with the Cramm is try to inspire and activate other members of my generation, so our readers, to go out there and create change themselves. So a lot of what I do with the Cramm is sort of translating that information and then actually showing my generation how they can get involved. And a lot of that involves obviously writing to Congress members, trying to motivate young people to get involved with Congress, and these, I think, more like regular institutes of government. And I think that that's a really big part of Gen Z too. When people ask me about defining aspects of my generation, is that because we're so young, for so long, we've been locked out of these like traditional ways of getting involved in the world, like government. Like I just turned 18 a few months ago. I'm just now able to vote in the midterms. So I think that that's led to a lot of distrust, and maybe just not a sense that there's an availability there for us to get involved. So that's a lot of what I try to do, is motivate young people and show them that you actually can get involved. And we actually should try to get involved, because that'll show our Congress members that there's that interest and engagement there.
Fantastic. Alexandria, any thoughts about that, engaging with Congress?
Fully aligned. There were a few internships at the beginning of my professional journey, one in particular with the United Nations Foundation, and they had a very strong advocacy arm where they were engaging young people and everyday citizens on how to advocate and lobby at the Hill, particularly with the Better World campaign, on why it's important for our nation to be leading with diplomacy, with exploring the 4Ds, for example. And so I think that that's an important element. I always like to say, in this kind of social change ecosystem, it's important that we all understand what our role is and what our natural gift is in that system, because, it's a little ambitious to think we all are, should be all encompassing, the leader who can address all of these things, but understanding how we fit into that social change ecosystem, I think, is important for young folks in particular.
Fantastic. Sarah, obviously you've worked in the executive branch. Any thoughts about engaging Congress as far as bringing new voices to the table?
Yeah, I mean, I just an anecdote. I was at a meeting of national security and foreign policy folks a couple of weeks ago, and we had a panel by 4 members of Congress that all came from different districts in terms of their demographics and how safe or not safe their districts were. They were all under 40. And I just thought, wow, this is the next generation of Congress. I get very enthusiastic when I scroll through my Instagram and, you see lots of young people posting the number to call their member of Congress, and here are the steps how to do it. And I think we're going to see some demographic shifts in membership in Congress, but I think there is a young generation that are finding ways to connect with their members no matter what their age is. It's not that hard to use that 202 switchboard number. There's ways to tweet at your member of Congress, and a lot of times they're watching that, they're replying. They have to be. This is part of their constituency, and so I perhaps I'm the eternal optimist, but I look at this generation and say they're active, and if their member of Congress isn't being responsive, they're going to find a way to make change happen, whether it's with Congress or without them. And so I do think members of Congress are being increasingly responsive to that. And I'm also just encouraged by the number of people that are running for office, not just Congress, but local offices, state offices. I think we're seeing a generation that is not afraid to sort of make their voice heard and raise their hand and say, I want to be a part of the solution, whether that solution is in government or out of it. And so, I'm generally bullish on sort of where government service is going and the way that young people are engaging with their members and their representatives.
Thank you for that. I was actually going to ask you about engagement at the state and local level, so I appreciate you touching on that. So we're gonna come up soon on the end of our time together, which, by the way, has been terrific. And I'd like to end with sort of a quick round robin. So looking to you for 30-second responses. I'm going to ask you each 2 questions. Let's start with the first one, and I'd like to start with Sarah. As we think about America's global engagement, what's the one area where you think current leaders aren't paying close enough attention?
Man, you're giving me the hard one. Well, I'm always going to be the advocate for our government looking at entrepreneurs of all kinds, social entrepreneurs, technology entrepreneurs, business entrepreneurs, especially in the youth demographic. I think about I'll call him a friend now, who's the CEO of an incredible company out of Egypt that has raised a lot of local money out of the Middle East, but also from investors in Silicon Valley. He started because he thought more people in his community needed bread delivery in the morning, and it has turned into a huge way for people across Egypt and soon across the Middle East to get their groceries in a timely way. This is allowing for economic advancement for a lot of people. It's employing people in a region that desperately needs more employment options, particularly for young people. And I think this is the kind of person that we need to be investing in, not just the person that happens to come through a foreign policy or political school. And so, I will always be an advocate for making sure that our leaders in government are trying to find sort of the diamonds in the rough, the people that are outside of the sort of normal engagement channels.
That is fantastic. Olivia, how about you? Where are we not paying attention where we should be?
Yeah, I mean, as Sarah said with entrepreneurship, I'm always going to be the advocate for young people, and the fact that we are already getting involved so much in the world and already expressing that we really want change to be made. And I think we'll see a lot of maybe people in power who champion the fact that we're so involved, which is incredible. And they'll maybe say, oh, I love that they're getting involved in this way or that way, but they're not maybe actually working to implement the changes that we're wanting. So I think that's a really big place where I think that our governments, if they actually hold us a bit more into the involvement, so we weren't working so much on the outside, that would be a really incredible change.
Hear, hear. Alexandria, how about you? Where aren't current leaders paying close enough attention?
I'm a big believer in feedback loops, learning loops. And I think that a big, if not the biggest thing that our leaders could and should be focusing on, when your parents tell you, do as I say, not as I do, but really we as children or as a student, right, of those learning, we learn based off of action, based off of what we see. We should be I see there being an opportunity for the leaders of our nation across the different sectors to, one, be tracking the learning that they're actually experiencing, and then making sure to articulate that in a way that is applicable to the next generation coming through.
Okay. Well, and you all, in a way, with your responses, have anticipated my second question. And I think by definition, you all are just fundamentally optimists, it seems. What about the state of the world fills you with hope about the future? Alexandria, can we start with you?
Absolutely. My mentees, the next generation coming under me, they fill me, because there are days that I really may feel down or feel discouraged by, there's so many things happening in the world and so many crises, and just the optimism of those that I look to. They think I'm the one who's pouring into them, but it's also vice versa. So I would say my mentees and my younger generation peers, as I like to call them.
Fantastic. Olivia, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that my generation specifically has been able to constantly find new ways to get involved and new solutions to problems that need to be solved. I think we've seen that, especially over the past few years, with March for Our Lives, Fridays for Future, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, with all the incredible solutions and to problems created by the pandemic. It just gives me so much hope, the fact that people are so willing to actually be innovative and find new solutions to problems that are either new or have been existing for a very long time.
I know this is meant to be a round robin, but I have to ask you a follow-up. Do you think there's staying power in that? I mean, do you think once people get involved that they're going to stay involved?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it depends on, I think we've seen a year or a period of time where people have been especially getting involved. I think the summer of 2020 was a really big example of that, or like sort of winter, spring of 2018 with March for Our Lives, because those were issues that really directly engaged young people and stuck around for a few months, and the problems stuck around a lot longer. So I think we are seeing people who, I think once they get involved, they understand the power that they have as young people. And I don't think that goes away, that understanding and that belief of our ability to create change.
Fantastic. I'm so relieved to hear that. Sarah, how about you? What gives you hope?
Maybe this is a spin on what the other two have said, but I'm gonna classify it as builders give me hope. I think that there are so many more people that are building things that never reach the newspaper, that they're folks that see a problem and just say, I'm going to find a solution to it. And I have a mentality of yes, versus the laundry list of reasons why my idea can't work. And sometimes those ideas don't work out, but that's okay, because they'll use that to build something else. I think about, here at Stripe, we just pulled together a nearly $1 billion fund for carbon removal. The kinds of companies that we're purchasing carbon from these are builders. They're thinking about, what does the next 20 years look like to solve the problems of climate change, using incredibly interesting technology, but also things like sinking kelp beds in the ocean to extract carbon. I mean, these are sort of ideas that somebody just woke up one day and said, I'm going to build it. And I think that is really exciting. And I think we need more of that in Washington. Yes. And so that's what gives me hope every day.
That's fantastic. Well, I have to say, it's been such a treat to spend some time with all three of you. You give me hope, indeed, about the way forward for our country and globally. Because I think it's just clear to me that you bring so much energy and passion to what you're doing to try to bring younger people along and get them involved in a durable way in helping to solve some of our greatest challenges today. So I want to thank Olivia, Alexandria, and Sarah for joining us today. I want to thank everybody who's been watching. We will be in touch, hopefully very soon, with information about our next InSTEP program. But for now, I hope everybody has a terrific evening, and we'll see you soon.